Hi, folks. Welcome to episode one of this little mini series of interviews that I'm calling View from the Touchline. So, as I said on my Instagram post the other day, the idea behind putting this series together was that with lockdown coming in and no football outside of elite level kind of cancelled for the foreseeable future, it's a hard time for everyone, but it's also a time for a bit of self-reflection, a bit of self-learning. And I know in previous lockdowns, things like podcasts, webinars have been really useful for me in terms of my learning as a coach and my development. So I just thought this would be a good way to share some ideas and some advice from coaches working at different levels of the game. If you're watching this and you're not interested in coaching at all and you're purely just a football fan, then I do hope you enjoy just the discussion about football as well. And by all means, if you do have any feedback after watching this for me, please do just drop it in a private message to the Instagram page. So without further ado, I will introduce my guest for this first episode. So my first guest this week is Sam James. Sam, thank you very much for giving up your time today. Really appreciate it. So for those of you who didn't see the Instagram post yesterday, Sam is currently working as a women's academy coach at Man United. He's a B license holder and he also holds the FA Youth Award. Prior to working for Man United, Sam was a women's head coach at Loughborough University, where I had the privilege of coaching alongside him in my first year. And Sam's also worked for the likes of Crystal Palace, Fulham, and Notts County as well. So, Sam, my first question for you today is, what does coaching and the role of a coach mean to you?
Yeah, great question. Firstly, hi folks, hope you're well. Thanks, mate, for having me on. Coaching, I think, it means different things to different people. Is probably the first thing to say, and we'll probably draw on that as we go through. I think probably there's two main things for me that I think about with it is it's pursuing excellence. So it's pursuing excellence for your player, your individual at that point that you're working with. And the second one for me is around kind of maximizing the learning that can happen within that environment. We'll touch on different environments again as we go through, but maximizing learning as a player. So what are the technical, tactical, physical considerations for that player? Also then what individual areas can you work on as well? So communication, managing your lifestyle, kind of dealing with adversity, being resilient, are all different things that I think you will develop when you maximize the learning of that person. When I mention excellence, we'll talk about differentiation later, but excellence obviously looks like different things for different people. And we have to accept that, and not every player is one size fits all. And like we know, don't we, kind of, we work with coaches, or we're aware of coaches that I think see the game as one lens, or they see the game as one thing. So being a coach is being technically and tactically really strong, and that is it. And I totally agree, that is a really important component of it, but it's not the only component with football. And I think one of the things that sticks in my mind is it's all well and good having the technical and the tactical information, but if you can't communicate that to your player, or you can't make your player realize or understand what you're saying, there is literally no point in having that information other than it's either stuck in your head or it's written down on a piece of paper. It won't go anywhere. So I think we have to be aware that coaching like transcends so many different areas, and there's so many criteria that a coach should be competent within, away from just kind of the technical and the tactical elements of being a coach, really.
Yeah, I think that's massive, that personal side of it that you've touched on there as well, not just being technically and tactically competent, but also being able to build relationships with your players as well. And then that way your messages are almost easier to communicate across. Just to ask you, where do you think that passion for working with people came from? Because obviously people who go into coaching, it almost starts with a passion for football and wanting to get involved with that side of the game. But where do you think your passion for working with people and developing those
I
relationships
think it's
came from?
something that probably builds over time when you can see it happening. And you always look back at, the problem is with coaching, you always look back on things with like rose tinted spectacles, and you always think it was probably a lot better than it actually was. But hey, that's kind of what the only information we have. So if I think about, I played semi-pro until 18, then I went to uni obviously, and we coached together, and that then was just, football was what I love to do. I love playing. And then I did FA course, FA programs, youth sport trust programs to kind of upskill me and give me exposure to that. And it was only really, I think, when we worked together in my second year, your first year of uni, and we had an environment where we were on the grass a lot of the time. We were working with people on pitch, off pitch. We were in lectures with people as well, which is another dynamic, which is hard. Like if you're not you've got to enjoy being around people or learning from people and working with them. So it's just something that I think really becomes integrated. And once, as I say, when I mentioned about looking back with rose-tinted spectacles, once you have success or whatever you deem as success, you then start to really enjoy it. And I think that they're the best coaches, those that are natural in terms of how they are with people, how positive they are, how they can deal with conflict, etc. They're the best coaches. And you talk about like different social dynamics as well. Like we both know, if players can look through someone, or some players can be really critical of coaches, and it's really important that you understand them, you take the time to understand them. They can see you how you want to be seen, and you can see them how they want to be seen. And then at that point, I feel as though you can have maximum impact. Without that, I think you're going to fall short of whatever success looks like for you, or whatever you want, really.
Yeah, that's a perfect answer, really. In terms of, so you say you played semi-pro until you were just before you went to uni. Was when we coached together at Loughborough, was that your first experience of working in the women's game, or had you had experience of that prior?
So prior to 18, I'd done grassroots level boys and grassroots level girls with a local club. I'd done open age men as well at that point. But when we worked together with Loughborough, that was my first exposure of women's football, probably more open age, kind of under 23s level women's football, and also within a more, I guess, performance environment. So yeah, I'd say it probably was.
What would you have said what was the biggest initial challenge, do you think, about not just working in the women's game, but working in university football? Because I know when I first started, it was very different to the grassroots and school environments I've been in prior. So
Yeah.
what do you think was the biggest challenge that you faced early on?
For me, it was probably a little bit around age. Did you feel the same?
Yeah.
Because you almost feel like a boy walking in, and you feel, because there's so many social dynamics going on. There's so much kind of interaction going on with different people, etc. I think probably an age thing was a big one. That was a big challenge, and almost having the confidence to coach and put on the hat that you need to put on was really, really hard. I think there's a point also around like coaching under pressure. So I don't think some coaches realize it, but I think there are times in seasons, there are times over years where coaches have to coach under pressure, and that pressure might present itself as, maybe in the university environment, some of the older players don't think you're a very good coach, so you've kind of got to put real graft into your sessions to prove, whatever that means, prove to the players that you are a good coach. It might be performances aren't going right, so you feel as though you've got to get your sessions bang on, so that then the performances can kind of fall out of that. And maybe also some players don't feel as though they're developing with kind of working with you, which I think kind of hits you a little bit personal. But that's kind of dealing with that pressure is really hard, and recognizing that you're going to have to put more time, well, not more time, you're just going to have to be really thorough in terms of your delivery. You're going to have to plan for all eventualities. But I think they're the best like opportunities to learn. I feel as though we learned so much in the year that we were, you came in as goalkeeper coach and then transferred over, but I feel as though we learned so much, didn't we, in that year?
Yeah, it was definitely probably one of the biggest learning curves I've had, in terms of having come from like a grassroots environment, working in, coaching school teams and things like that, to be put into that environment. I think when you touch on coaching under pressure, I think that was a massive thing. I think even the pressure to prepare the team for a match day with limited time, and with obviously working in a uni environment, you've got, you don't know what your number is going to be every session, because people have lectures, people have part-time jobs, people play for different clubs outside of the uni as well. So I think that almost trying to get your principles and ideas across whilst having to battle that, almost imposter syndrome of, oh, am I too young for this? Are these people actually going to listen to me? I think that was definitely a big challenge. If we fast forward then to your final year, obviously you ended up being first team head coach at Loughborough for the women's club. So not only were you, coaching the head coach of the first team, but you also sort of head coach for the whole club. So you were overseeing the first team, but also overseeing the other three Bucks teams and then the Sunday team as well, in terms of looking after their coaches. So how did you feel when you first started that role, in terms of you went from just being a coach of a team to having been maybe the head coach of a whole club?
Yeah, I think initially I probably walked in and thought, no, this is going to be quite straightforward. Like, it's just one team, you just times it over 3 and it's job done. But then I think you soon realise that there's so many, you've got to be so thorough in what you do to ensure that you are successful. And I think the biggest thing that I've found probably since we worked together and kind of the years, the 3 or 4 years that have fallen off the back of that, is you drive your own standards and you almost find yourself being the one that is telling you that it's got to be better. And I think that's the thing, you never want to settle. So you never want it just to be whatever it is. You always want it to be better and better and better. And I think that's the thing that can sometimes either tip you, and you have to accept in times of loss or times where it is hard, you either accept, okay, that's fine for now, we can then move back on, or we'll go about a different angle and come back in, rather than trying to just force all the time. So it is a slow burner. It's never going to be a quick fix. But I absolutely loved it, like the opportunity to, and this is, we'll talk about environments, won't we? But to work at Loughborough in the university environment with the performance services that are there, you're on the grass kind of 4 or 5 times a week. You've got the opportunity to have thorough IDPs with players. You get your games recorded. Like, it's a fantastic opportunity. And I think it might have, it was hard to balance with uni, let's put it that way. And the grades maybe reflected that. But just that opportunity was fantastic. But definitely at the start, nervous, unsure, you're trying to convince or get kind of 60, 70 players on board with how you want to run things. So a definite challenge, but over time, with the right attitude and the right kind of messages at the right time, you kind of get there.
Yeah, I think we both kind of graduated with that feeling of it was really worth it, even if maybe the academic side of things did take a backseat at times, whether it was intentional or not. But even I found writing my dissertation in final year, I wrote it about coach behaviors, and having actually coached in that environment and worked in that environment, it was more engaging to write, and it was also easier to write, I think, as well. So it was definitely a valuable experience. If we move on then to your role now, so obviously you're an academy coach at Man United Women, which is a great position for you to be in. Before we talk more in depth about that, what were the initial differences and also similarities that jumped out to you between working in university football to then going into working academy football?
I think every year as I've gone through, and I'm sure you're probably the same, mate, you look back on what you did the previous year and you kind of wonder why you did it, or some things make you cringe, don't they? Like, I remember some of the things I used to say or do made me cringe, and I've probably had that quite a lot since going into United. So looking back on what I've previously done in uni environments more so, or open age environments, I now reflect on that and cringe. And I think that's the difference between true development football and what that entails, and what kind of open age performance or emerging performance football brings you. So I'll give you an example. For me, in terms of my role as a coach with the girls at United at the moment, my biggest thing is around kind of maximizing opportunity to learn. So if we go kind of dig into technical bits, in a game environment, if a ball is rolling out of play, for example, we've seen it, the ball comes over the top, the centre half runs off, they'll let the ball roll out of play. That's one of my biggest pet peeves at the moment. It's around that opportunity there. I want the player to put their foot on the ball, to play out of pressure. Yes, we might sacrifice a goal. We might sacrifice success, if that's what you call it. But for me, that opportunity to learn is so much more valuable than any kind of result or win or 3 points. So that's probably a really big thing for me. And we'll look at session design, I'm sure, but just around when you've got the guys in your sessions, how are you getting the best out of them? So if you're running some kind of practice, is there repetition in there? So are your players doing the same movements at the same time to develop the same principles? If they're not, how can you manufacture that? And it might be a case of you doing like a possession practice, for example, with a goalkeeper. As players playing, you have someone firing footballs into your goalkeeper, so they're getting repetitions, and all the time you're kind of maximizing that opportunity to learn, which is something that either I don't feel was applicable or we didn't do in a university environment, but now is really, really important. And I guess a question for you, mate, with United, we obviously have blueprints of players and structures of what our first team player looks like, which is really, really important. That's something I don't feel as though we particularly had when we were in the university environment. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that.
Yeah, I think so. I think sometimes in uni football, there's a blurred line between, are we training these players to purely get results for the team they're playing in, or are we training them to try and push up to the first team? It's difficult because, particularly at Loughborough, both the women's and men's program, the first team have such a big panel, and so much of their recruitment comes from freshers, and they get freshers in, and it is difficult to progress up the club. And we had in the women's program, I think we had quite a few players who did, push on up to the first team from that group we had in my first year. But I think, with the limited time we have at uni, and almost the pressure you feel to get results, because the uni places so much emphasis on being the best football team in the country and having the most bucks points, it can be difficult to almost look away from that short-term view of where we have to prepare to win next week, rather than thinking of, what does this player need? Okay, this player's come in first year. What does he or she need over the course of the next 2 years to be playing in the first team in final year?
Yeah, massive.
So yeah, it is a difficult one. I think you touched on session design there. I think for me, whenever I was a coach, especially last year with the men's program, we felt that we could really develop individuals through our sessions, and we tried to do that, but the main focus had to be on preparing the team for the game coming up on the Wednesday. Because almost from a selfish point of view, you think you're a coach in final year, you want to win something. Like from a selfish point of view, you're not worried about progressing that fresher through to get to the first team by the time they're in final year. So it was all about that match preparation, where, as I'm sure I'll ask you this now, but your session design, I'm sure, has changed going to United, because at Loughborough it was probably just mainly tactical, mainly game prep, whilst trying to develop individuals within that, whereas now you've got that sort of long-term development view within your session plan.
Absolutely. And it's a really interesting one, because when you look back at what we deem success in terms of winning things, once you leave that environment, I think you view it very, very differently.
Yeah.
That makes me feel like I was a fool for thinking whatever. But in the moment, you think that. And I think there's probably loads of coaches that, like, in the environment they're in at the moment, if it is a very much performance-based environment, they think that winning this is the most important thing. So actually stepping away from that, or finding some kind of perspective away from that, is really important. I think if you're not doing that, then there is potential that you can compromise development. But yeah, it's a really good point in terms of kind of how we would then do it in this environment. It's kind of using cycles. So 6-week blocks that you then tailor down into potentially 1 or 2 week blocks within that, around different components that then fit into a wider kind of development program. And the biggest thing that I always say about, like, for me as a coach, I'll kind of say I don't care about the result. Other coaches might kind of phrase it differently, but for me, I really don't care about the result. And my thinking around that is, if that player goes on to sign pro at 18, when they look back at when they were in the under 9s, for example, are they going to remember if they won a game against whatever football club? The reality is no. But what they might remember is that lesson that they learned, that opportunity that they had to play at a certain part of the pitch, or a certain situation they found themselves in. That kind of learning experience will carry through with them to their 18. That memory of winning that game won't carry through with them until they're 18. So it's that. That's kind of how I always try and pursue it. So yeah, going back to kind of cycles. So it sits as part of a bigger blueprint with a first team player. What does that look like? How do you then manage that? And everything that we do is kind of underpinned by IDPs. And I think that's a really, really important thing to mention, and something that, reflecting on university, we probably didn't do as much. So every player has an IDP, kind of technical, tactical, physical. And this is obviously, in my experience, across all different football clubs. The biggest thing for me, I think, with that IDP is that if you're doing a practice, you kind of have your theme of the practice and obviously your coaching points that you want to go with that. But it's really important that as a coach, you can read cues or read triggers that make you think differently about your coaching points. I think we always know coaches that get really excited. I've been guilty of it. You get really excited for delivering like a coaching point because you know it looks really cool, or everyone's like, oh, that's mad, I've never thought of that before. The reality is they have, it's just in a just phrased differently. So actually being able to deliver a session on a theme and recognizing where your players are genuinely at in that session, and then taking it whatever kind of course of action it needs to go off the back of that. Because I think, again, you're going to miss lessons if you don't do that.
Yeah. Just to go back to that point you mentioned about how you're a coach that in your current role you don't care about results, and in terms of academy football, you're definitely not alone in that in feeling that way, and I would be inclined to agree with you as well. But there has been an argument made, and Twitter is a wonderful place for sharing football opinions, but it can also be an absolute complete disaster at times as well. But there's questions thrown up from time to time about, how do we almost coach or help our players understand what it takes to win and how to deal with loss as well.
Yeah,
So I think the point you made about you don't care about the result because you want that player to remember the lesson, I think that's like a really, really, really strong idea. How do you then also help, because these players are hopefully going to end up playing for Man United women's first team, and
yeah.
the pressure on them to succeed at that level will be high. How do you prepare them for learning how to win and then also how to deal with loss and react to loss?
I think it's something you can put into your session design. So can you make your sessions really competitive? Can you promote players that are going to give 110% in sessions? Because then I feel as though that's a bit more of a safe environment for loss. So if it does happen, you can then manage that a lot easier. You
Yeah.
can obviously kind of have the interventions that you need to have to ensure that that can happen. So kind of get your sessions really competitive if you need to. I think no matter how much I don't care about the result, the players ultimately will still care about the result.
Yeah.
So you need to have a consideration for that and use that to your advantage. But I think the messages coming from the coach shouldn't be, in my opinion, we need to do this to win the game of football, or kind of, I guess you could say that, as long as you're not deferring away from your principles. I think as soon as you compromise your principles for a win, that then gets dangerous. But I think you can certainly harness it and use it. And again, it's being aware of the kind of social dynamics. You got parents as well to think about. And if they lose a game, are they going to go in the car and the parents say, "Why'd you lose the game?" They're not going to turn around to their mum and dad and go, "Yeah, I lost the game, but I learned this." But then that's more important to me because of the pressure and everything that comes with that level of football. So I think it's definitely there. Be aware of it, use it, mirror it in your sessions as much as you can. And then sometimes you just got to kind of let things happen and react to those.
Yeah, spot on. If we can touch on for a bit now about sort of creating environments. I know you've talked about you want to, within your sessions, you like to create an environment where you can completely optimize learning and create potential for learning. In terms of an actual creating a team environment, obviously we work together at Loughborough, and the thing I really enjoyed about uni football, both men's and women's game, was sort of the team environment you could create, because all the players tend to be pretty close on and off the pitch. Okay, you have your little social groups within that, but they tend to be quite close off the pitch. People attend lectures together, people go out together, people sometimes even live together as well. So it makes that team environment quite not easy to make, but it's a lot stronger, I feel, than sometimes grassroots environments.
Yeah.
In your role at United, obviously you've got girls, I imagine, coming from clubs all over the greater Manchester area, and
Yeah.
maybe don't, there's probably social groups within that, but they don't go to the same schools, they haven't come from the same clubs. How do you try and obviously the relationship is different because you're so much older than them, whereas at uni, you have to be their mate as well, almost,
Yeah.
to make that dynamic work. How do you, in the role at United now, try and create those positive environments?
I think it's really important that you have values that are agreed. So at the start of the season, sit down with the players and unpick some of the values that you believe. For us, they come from first team, which is fantastic. So the first team have sat down and given us 3 different areas that they see as really important as values. And then what we do is we take those and then we tailor those to our age group. So we sit with the girls and we say, what does this mean to you? They can then give us kind of insight in terms of what they see that looking like in training, in games, away from training, etc. So we use that really heavily. And we use that to a point of, if there's someone in a session that isn't doing something, we always find a way to relate it back to the values, because that's the consistent theme. I think as soon as you start kind of adding in your own input in terms of what you think is important, that then becomes confusing. So keep it simple, keep them quite generic, so you can then kind of always go back to them. I think an MDT is something that is really important within that as well. So recognizing that as a coach, you have a set remit. The sport of science has their set remit, physical performance, sports science. Physio has their own remit, kind of analysis has their own remit as well, and recognizing that. Because I think with that clarity, the players then know what can be expected, so they're more likely to react better to certain situations. And then I think it just links, one of the points I think for me in terms of that age group is being connected to those players. And it is really hard, and some coaches do it better than others, but I think ultimately it comes again back down to how you're communicating with the player. Are you listening to them? Are you understanding them? Talking about things maybe not football related to get a little bit of buy-in, so they kind of know you're on the same level as them, and then just kind of build that as you go through. But I think consistent values are really, really important. I mean, as your role as a sports science, how did you find, because obviously I guess you were bouncing between age groups, so how did you find kind of contributing to the environment that way?
So obviously I did my placement at Southampton in a S&C in sports science role, as you say, that I worked right across the 9s to 16s, and I really enjoyed having lots of age groups to work with, because it allowed you to build relationships with different types of kids, as well as, you know, different types of players. So for example, the way I would try and build a relationship with an under 9 would be very different to the way I would try and build a relationship with an under 15 player.
Definitely.
You said it's about trying to talk about things not to do with football, trying to understand what are the big things in their lives that they enjoy, that they, you know, that excites them and stuff like that as well.
And be genuine with it as well. Like, don't just say it for the sake of saying it, or be like, oh, how are you? How was your day? Like, and just be genuine. Like, have a chat like you would with anybody, I think.
Yeah, I think whenever you have those conversations with a player, whether it be in an academy, whether it be at uni, whatever environment you're in, if they see that you're genuine, it makes your message easier to get across. It makes dealing with them in sessions, and then it also makes difficult conversations easier, because they know that you've got their best intentions at heart, and that, you know, you're not being a dickhead, for want of a better word. You know, that's they know you're genuine, and that definitely helps with that. In terms of,
sorry mate, I think that ties into IDPs really well as well, because the voice of a coach can't always be positive. The voice of a sports science can't always be positive. You're doing this really well, you're doing this really well. So the importance of having an IDP in place and a mechanism to give them feedback initially is really, really important. So when they finish a session, give them constructive feedback on what they could have done better, That then manages your boundaries and ensures that the players know the relationship they have with you. But also it's not always positive, because that isn't genuine of the environment that you're going to be in. These people want to make it professional. They're not going to make it professional by just being polite and nice. Well, polite, yes, nice all the time. So that's just not kind of the best thing for them, really.
I think one of the big things I learned at Southampton as well, I don't know if you picked up on this, but maybe naively, before I went into that sort of environment, I thought, like, of the under 12 age group, for example, I thought, right, these kids are going to be really good at football. They're going to turn up. They're always going to want to learn. They're going to be so enthusiastic about it. They're going to be the most ideal kids to work with. When in reality, they're just completely normal 11, 12-year-olds. They do the exact same things as other 11, 12-year-olds. They just happen to be talented at football.
Absolutely.
And I think that was a real, it was difficult, because at the end of the day, from a purely footballing point of view, the pure football goal of an academy is to try and produce players for the first team. And you always have that in the back of your mind. And it's difficult whenever you're working with 10, 11, 12-year-olds and the thought of being in the first team is so far away. But you almost have to have that in the back of your mind. And that's when the conversations around maybe standards, or like from a sports science point of view, if, you know, they're not hitting the physical metrics that they need to be hitting to be, as they progress up the age groups, to then have a chance of playing in the first team. It's about building that into your relationship with them, and then being able to guide them along that process as well.
Yeah, and that's what excellence looks like for that player. Like, everyone's different version of excellence is different, and as a coach, you've got to be really critical in terms of what are the important areas we need to work on, because time is limited. As you say, kids are kids. And one of the things you always say, coaches go, oh, if I was 12 years of age at this football club, I wouldn't be acting very different. It's like, yeah, but you're like 27, so you're going to think differently. You've got to be realistic about where you can maximize the opportunity. And you're exactly right. As long as you can get those little bits that you need, those little wins, and build that relationship, you're onto a winner. But if you bombard them with, I need you to get better at this, technically, tactically, physically, you lose them. And it's not going to be.
I remember reading I'm currently reading a book that's, you might have read it. It's by Michael Calvin. It's called No Hunger in Paradise. And it's basically, it's just about sort of the hidden side of academy football and kind of like what players go through and what staff go through. And there's a really interesting bit in it from Nick Levitt, who is director of coaching at UK Coaching at the minute, but he used to be an academy coach at Fulham, I think. But he talks about how he planned a perfect session one day. He was so excited to deliver it, and for the entire hour and a half or whatever it was of the session, the kids were just all over the place. Like, engagement wasn't there. Kids were like upset and crying, and it was only after the session that he found out that right before the session started, one of the kids had told one of the other kids a certain piece of news about Father Christmas that just destroyed that kid. So it's things like that coaching courses and coaching manuals don't tell you about, and absolutely. It's something you've got to be so aware of.
Yeah, 100% agree.
If we just move on a bit, we've touched on differentiation slightly. Obviously, in a uni environment, you've got, we work with the second team whenever we work together, and you've got players in that environment who are pushing to the first team. You've also got players who are kind of in the middle, and you've got players who are at the bottom but still better than playing in the team below, if that makes sense. In terms of United, I guess it's a similar thing, real mixed ability. You'll obviously have kids who are what we call, striving and thriving. You've got kids who are barely even, they're struggling to keep up, really. How do you manage that within your sessions? How do you tailor your sessions to provide that learning opportunity for everyone?
I think it's a really good point in terms of striving, struggling, etc. And we hear that phrase used. I think the thing for me in terms of reflecting on where a player's at is they might be striving in one area, but they might be struggling in another area. And the likelihood is with the academy level, the likelihood is they're all going to be good players. Like, you don't generally, and I appreciate this will be hard for kind of more grassroots coaches where there might be a bigger separation between the top and the bottom of the session. But so for me, it's about always recognizing that, because we might be working on a certain theme and I might have a thought in my mind about a player not being good enough, but actually if I break it down, actually they're really strong in this area. It's just because we worked on other areas that they've potentially shown more weakness. So the way that I would kind of do differentiation is about being deliberate with your practice. So this is probably something that I learned a couple of years ago around being deliberate with where you put your players in your practice. And so can you hide that differentiation, basically? And get really, really specific with it. So if you're working with a striker that's really poor in a 1v1 situation, for example, you might then put a progression on a practice where you ensure that striker is either married at 1v1 with a centre half, or they've got to drop into a space where they've then got to engage 1v1. That player then doesn't know that you think they're not very good 1v1. They're working on 1v1 principles and also tying in the principles that you want within your session as well. So you can really dig a little bit deeper. And all that stems from just being deliberate with where you put your players. And I love the idea of players working on so many different things within a session. It gets a bit complicated, but we work on so many different things within a session, but they don't even know it. So, and because your sessions are repetitive and they're real, those skills will then come out in a game. And again, they don't even know it. And I think that's a subtlety of coaching that's really, really important and something that I've learned quite recently. So that's probably one way that we would kind of differentiate between that as well. And I think sometimes it is important, like you just mentioned with the story about Nick there around, sometimes players will have off days. Players will have days that are a real struggle. And there is absolutely zero benefit in continuing to try and push that player or take that player beyond their breaking point when you can see that for that day, it just isn't happening. And differentiating your practice in that way to either, I guess, change the focus so that your sessions become a bit more fun-based and you take away that competitive element that might cause stress, or that you kind of, again, you're deliberate in your placing, that you might then put your strongest player against a weaker player to give that player the confidence boost. And you're deliberate in terms of how you marry your practice up. And I think reflecting on what we did it with the twos, I don't think we did that really, did we? We just kind of did a lot of position specific, which I think a lot of coaches do, but potentially not deliberate in the actual individual and what they need.
And I guess that probably comes down to the experience we had at the time and the experience we've gone on to get, and also it comes back to that issue of time you have on the grass and the pressure of wanting to prepare the team as much as you can for match day. But yeah, definitely something I've learned as well. I think that point you make about hiding differentiation is crucial, because like 9, 10, 11-year-olds are smart. If you tell them that, oh, for example, if you're doing simple rondo, for example, and you've got your players who are at the top end in your group, you can maybe limit them to the number of touches they can have, whereas you can tell another player they can take as many touches as they want. That player is going to realize what you're doing, you know.
Yeah.
And some players can see it for what it is and say, fair enough, I need to develop. But then young kids especially can see it as, oh, this coach doesn't rate me, he doesn't think I'm as good as. So
Exactly.
definitely hiding it is a really good way of putting that in.
And I think you can also hide within it from an MDT perspective. Something that I've really liked is if you're working with a physical performance coach and for example, you've got a player that either isn't kind of good enough at a certain area or it's a physical consideration of a topic. So if you're doing pressing, for example, with that player, or you tell me as a sports science, I got this wrong, you need to accelerate quite quickly, then slow down, don't you, really?
Yeah.
Is one of the main principles. So how can you then integrate that in your session so that they get those elements within that? And again, if you've got a player that isn't particularly strong in those areas, how can you then tailor your practice to also include that? So you differentiate with the player itself, but then you also differentiate across the different MDT areas as well, I think is really important, because then you get a really holistic practice. You're not just working technically or tactically, you've then got physical considerations in there as well. I think that's really clever.
Yeah, definitely. We're almost out of time, Sam, but I'm going to finish with some quick fire questions, and I completely nabbed this idea from the High Performance podcast, so I hope Jake Humphrey and Damien Hughes aren't watching, otherwise they'll probably sue me or something. But so the first question is, what 3 values are at the heart of your coaching philosophy?
I think the first one is that connectedness that we've touched on. So understand your players, get to know your players. The second one is commitment for me. So commitment to your players, commitment to yourself. So, and this is another thing around it, if there's grassroots coaches listening that think it's all about winning the game, for me, if you're in that environment and you only see success as winning, you're not doing it for yourself. And that's a really important consideration. I think a lot of times as coaches, we put ourselves in a situation, it might be really hard and it might take a lot of sacrifice and it'll take a lot of graft, but you're going to be better because of it. So that's got to be a driver as well. Commitment to yourself and to your players. And probably the third one will just be communication, I think, for me. Like we've mentioned, recognizing how to speak to certain age groups, how to get certain points across. I think that's probably the third one.
Great. Second question, what one thing do you want to learn, improve on in 2021 from a coaching point of view?
I think for me, probably sequencing is a big one. So sequencing my interventions, why I'm stepping in at a certain point, how does that link into the next one? How does that link into the bigger picture? So rather than just going off impulse and what I think, have a sequence to it. And then also allow that bit that I mentioned before, that if you can see a session going a certain type of way, go with that rather than kind of just hammering out coaching points for the sake of hammering out coaching points.
Brilliant. Third question, where do you want to be in 5 years' time?
I think I still want to be obviously within the game at an elite level, I think is the only thing I would say on that. The biggest thing for me in 5 years' time is I want to continue being as hungry as I am now. And I know I will be, but that's the biggest thing for me. Not settling, not recognizing you're at this club or whatever, or you're at this level. That means you're good. I think you've got to keep evolving. The game keeps evolving. Players keep evolving. Different ways of doing things are always about. So keep hungry and kind of keep as aware as I can of everything that's going on.
Great. And my last question then is, what is the best piece of advice you've ever received from a coaching point of view, from a life point of view?
The biggest one for me, because I'm a bit of a simpleton, you don't know what you don't know. And I think that's so powerful for me. Like you could be having, and I think I could just try and like rationalize or put it into an example. You could be having a conversation with another coach about a certain principle of the game, but because you don't know what they know, you're never going to see it. So you've always just got to, in everything that you do, recognize that there are things that you don't know. And unless you're told them or you have that experience, you're never going to know it. And I just think that one makes me feel really vulnerable, which is a really good feeling to have, I think, when you're delivering. Feel vulnerable that you don't know everything. And just also makes you realize the importance of working with people and recognizing other people's strengths and where they have kind of areas of knowledge that I might not have.
Perfect. Sam, thank you very much for your time today. It's been really insightful. I know hopefully a lot of people will get a lot of takeaways from that. If you are watching this and you have enjoyed it, or you've got some feedback, then please do send it to me, and I can feed it forward to Sam as well. If you've got any questions for Sam as well, by all means send them to me and I can pass them on to him. I know he's the kind of guy who'd be very happy to answer your questions. And yeah, so this is the first episode, and next week I'll have a different guest. So the guest will always be announced on the Tuesday, and then every episode will be going out on Thursday morning. So yeah, please do send me feedback. Please do share it with people you think may be interested as well, who may not have seen the account yet. And yeah, thank you for all the support so far. And Sam, thank you for joining me today.
You're welcome. Thanks, guys.